Avoidants often do not fully understand the damage they cause until the silence they created comes back to them with a force they never expected. They can move through relationships believing that you will remain available no matter how many times they pull away, shut down, disappoint you, or leave things unresolved. Your patience becomes something they quietly depend on. They start confusing your forgiveness with an endless supply of chances. They see you returning after every difficult moment and begin believing you always will. That is where their first major mistake happens. It is not necessarily that they intend to hurt you. Often they are focused so intensely on escaping emotional discomfort that they barely consider what their behavior leaves behind. They think about creating distance, finding relief, and protecting themselves, but they rarely stop to calculate what that retreat could eventually cost them. When they withdrew from you, became emotionally unavailable, or made choices that wounded you deeply, their attention was probably centered on escaping the intensity of the relationship rather than understanding your pain. They were thinking about how quickly they could create enough distance to feel comfortable again. They believed stepping away would solve the discomfort inside them. What they failed to recognize was that their escape was quietly destroying something they desperately needed. For an avoidant, closeness can activate fear, pressure, and vulnerability. Yet the loss of someone who genuinely cared can eventually create an emptiness that feels far more painful than the closeness they were trying to escape. That contradiction is where everything begins to unravel. They thought distance would protect them, but eventually that same distance became the reason they lost the connection that gave their emotional world stability. They assumed you would always be the person who returned after the silence. They expected you to reopen conversations, soften the tension, explain yourself, and somehow repair the emotional distance they created. Your love had become so dependable in their mind that they stopped recognizing it as something they needed to protect. They expected you to tolerate inconsistency because you had tolerated it before. They believed your devotion could stretch indefinitely without finally reaching its limit. Then something happened that they had never seriously prepared themselves for. You became quiet. You stopped chasing. You stopped trying to convince them to communicate. You stepped back, not because you wanted revenge, but because you finally understood that continuing to pursue someone who repeatedly hurts you comes at the expense of your own dignity. That change is what finally forces the consequences of their behavior to reach them. Your silence feels completely different from the distance they created themselves. They are familiar with withdrawing when emotions become uncomfortable. They know how to disappear, distract themselves, and create emotional space. But when you become silent, there is no longer anything for them to push against. You are not threatening them. You are not demanding an explanation. You are not creating drama. You are simply no longer participating in the same cycle. And that is precisely why it can affect them so deeply. They suddenly encounter a boundary they never expected. They have to recognize that your patience had a limit and your loyalty was a choice, not a permanent obligation. For perhaps the first time, they begin understanding that someone can genuinely love them and still decide that being repeatedly hurt is no longer acceptable. That realization can be far more powerful than any argument you could have had. They were comfortable believing that you would always remain somewhere within reach. They could retreat, come back, retreat again, and assume the connection would still be waiting. But when your presence disappeared completely, the emotional landscape changed. There were no more familiar messages, no reassurance, no attempts to reconnect, and no steady person waiting to bridge the distance. They began feeling the absence of something they had previously treated as ordinary. The very consistency they had overlooked became noticeable only after it disappeared. And that is one of the hardest lessons for an avoidant to face. Not everyone waits forever. Not everyone continues accepting mixed signals. Not everyone remains loyal while receiving very little in return. Your silence becomes a reality check. It shows them that love can be sincere without being limitless, and that someone can care deeply while still choosing to walk away from a pattern that keeps hurting them. Their greatest mistake was assuming that your love meant they could never lose you. They built an emotional expectation around your consistency. Every time you stayed after they pulled away, their belief became stronger that you would always return. They watched you make effort when they were distant. They saw you remain patient when they became cold. They noticed that even after periods of shutdown, you still tried to understand them. Instead of realizing how meaningful that effort was, they gradually treated it as normal. Your presence became part of the emotional background of their life. They did not consciously decide that they would take you for granted. Their patterns simply allowed them to become accustomed to receiving stability without having to consistently provide it themselves. That is why their eventual shock can be so intense. They never imagined that the person they depended on quietly could one day decide that enough was enough. Avoidants do not always consciously set out to test someone's loyalty. Their behavior itself becomes the test. The disappearing emotional walls, mixed signals, delayed responses, sudden shutdowns, and repeated retreats often come from patterns that existed long before the relationship. They learned somewhere along the way that emotional distance could make them feel safer. When you responded to those behaviors with patience and compassion, they learned that their defenses did not necessarily cost them the relationship. That made your presence feel predictable. They could retreat and still expect you to be there later. So when they crossed an important boundary or hurt you, they did not necessarily experience the moment as a permanent turning point. Somewhere inside, they still believed the relationship would survive because it had survived everything before. Your love had become their emotional safety net, even though they rarely acknowledged how much they depended on it. That is why betrayal can feel so insignificant to them in the beginning compared with what it eventually becomes. They may experience the betrayal as an escape from vulnerability rather than an event that could permanently change the relationship. They tell themselves that they needed space, that things had become too intense, or that they were simply protecting their independence. They may believe they can return whenever they feel ready. But the problem is that relationships are not frozen in time while someone decides whether they want to come back. The other person continues experiencing the consequences. Trust changes, feelings change, priorities change. A heart that repeatedly gets hurt eventually learns to protect itself. And when you finally stopped reaching toward them, they were confronted with the one outcome they never planned for. The person they assumed would remain available had finally chosen themselves instead. Your withdrawal forces a truth they have spent years avoiding. Love does not come with a lifetime guarantee. Loyalty cannot be demanded while inconsistency is continually offered. A person can understand your fears, respect your wounds, and still decide they cannot continue being hurt by them. That is a reality many avoidants struggle to accept because their internal strategy has always been based around controlling closeness. They know how to create distance when they feel overwhelmed, but they are not always prepared for someone else creating distance from them. They expect intimacy to become suffocating. They do not expect silence to become suffocating. Yet once you disappear from the emotional equation, they may discover that the space they once wanted has become painfully empty. The person they thought was simply waiting for them is no longer waiting. And suddenly, the consequences are no longer theoretical. They are living inside them. They may not miss you immediately when you leave. In many cases, the first thing they experience is relief. That does not necessarily mean they never cared. It can simply mean that the emotional pressure they associated with closeness has temporarily disappeared. Their nervous system relaxes because there is no longer an immediate demand for vulnerability, communication, or emotional engagement. They tell themselves that the distance was necessary. They convince themselves that they needed time alone. They may even believe they made the right decision. At this stage, they assume the silence will eventually end because, in their experience, silence has always been temporary. They expect you to reach out eventually. They expect the familiar cycle to restart. But when you do not return, that initial relief slowly changes into something else. The silence continues. The messages never arrive. And the emotional certainty they depended on begins disappearing. That is when your absence starts becoming louder than your presence ever was. They begin wondering why you have not checked on them. They question why you are not trying to repair things. They may look for signs that you are still emotionally available, only to find nothing. What once felt like freedom begins producing uncertainty. First comes disbelief. They cannot understand why your usual behavior has changed. Then comes restlessness. Their mind starts returning to the relationship because the expected outcome is no longer happening. Eventually, that restlessness can become emotional discomfort. They are no longer receiving the reassurance that their old pattern depended on. They may not know exactly what they are feeling, but they know something is missing. The person who was always there is not there anymore. And because they never prepared themselves for that possibility, your absence begins forcing them into emotional territory they normally avoid. Then comes the deeper discomfort. Without your presence helping stabilize the relationship, they have fewer ways to redirect their emotions outward. The anxiety they once managed by creating distance can return in a different form. They may become distracted, busy themselves with work, spend more time alone, talk to other people, or rely on familiar coping habits. But distractions cannot permanently resolve emotional loss. Eventually, the mind returns to what remains unfinished. They begin remembering conversations they once dismissed. They remember moments when you showed patience. They remember the small ways you cared. They notice details they did not appreciate when you were still available. What once seemed ordinary begins looking valuable because it is no longer guaranteed. This is where their perspective starts changing. They are not simply remembering you because they feel lonely. They are beginning to understand the role your presence played in their emotional life. They may try to replace the connection through distractions or even new relationships, but another person cannot automatically recreate the emotional history you built together. They may discover that conversations with others feel different. The comfort is different. The understanding is different. The sense of being known is different. That does not mean you were literally the only person they could ever love, but it can make them realize that meaningful emotional connection cannot simply be exchanged like an object. They may start revisiting memories because they are trying to understand what happened. They remember your consistency, your warmth, and the moments when you made them feel understood without demanding that they become someone else overnight. And slowly, they begin noticing the things they minimized when they had access to them. The absence creates a perspective that proximity never gave them. They finally see the value of what they had because they no longer have easy access to it. Avoidants often tell themselves that what they truly want is peace. They want less pressure, fewer expectations, more independence, and more control over their emotional space. But sometimes they discover too late that the person they pushed away was not the source of the chaos they were trying to escape. That person may have actually represented safety, warmth, and emotional grounding. Your silence becomes a mirror because it removes all the distractions that allowed them to avoid looking at their own behavior. It reflects the walls they built, the moments they chose distance, and the opportunities for connection they rejected. The painful part is not simply that they miss your company. It is realizing that they helped create the exact conditions that made you leave. They may finally understand that you were not trying to trap them, you were trying to build something with them, but they kept interpreting connection as pressure until there was no connection left. There is another painful contradiction in avoidant behavior. They can chase independence so intensely that they eventually create the very isolation they were trying to avoid. When they dismissed you, betrayed your trust, or minimized your feelings, they may have believed they were choosing freedom. They told themselves that more distance would bring clarity. They imagined that life would feel easier without emotional responsibility. At first, that story can feel convincing because distance gives them immediate relief. But immediate relief is not always the same thing as genuine peace. Sometimes what feels like freedom is simply the absence of intimacy. And once the emotional pressure is gone, they may discover that they also removed the warmth, companionship, understanding, and connection that came with it. The space they wanted can become an emptiness they never intended to create. In the beginning, they may rewrite the relationship in a way that makes their decision easier to accept. They might tell themselves you were too emotional, too demanding, too invested, or too intense. They may focus on the moments when closeness felt uncomfortable while ignoring everything you contributed. This helps them protect themselves from guilt. They can convince themselves that leaving was necessary because admitting they damaged something meaningful would force them to confront their own behavior. So they create a story where distance becomes the solution. But eventually, that story can become difficult to maintain. They begin meeting people who do not provide the same emotional depth. They may have conversations that feel pleasant but empty. They may experience attention without genuine understanding. And gradually, they recognize that what they once labeled as pressure may have actually been emotional intimacy they simply did not know how to tolerate. The emptiness rarely arrives all at once. It can begin as something subtle. Maybe they notice that certain moments feel different. A song reminds them of you. A familiar place brings back a memory. Something happens during the day and their first instinct is to tell you before remembering that they no longer can. They may experience an unexplained restlessness that they cannot connect to a specific cause. But as time passes, those small moments accumulate. The absence becomes more noticeable. The freedom they once celebrated starts feeling like isolation. The independence they protected begins resembling loneliness. And the distance that once helped them feel safe now prevents them from accessing something meaningful. This is where they may realize that losing you was not simply losing companionship. It meant losing a source of emotional stability they had quietly relied upon without understanding how deeply they depended on it. They may also realize that your presence brought out a side of them they rarely allowed other people to see. Around you, they may have been softer, more playful, more open, or more emotionally connected than they were comfortable admitting. You did not necessarily create that version of them. You simply gave it enough safety to emerge. When the relationship disappears, they can miss not only you, but also the version of themselves that existed in that connection. That can be surprisingly painful. They may look at their life and realize that they feel more guarded again. The walls return, the emotional distance becomes familiar, and suddenly, the independence they fought so hard to preserve feels less like strength and more like another form of protection. That is when they begin understanding something they could not see while you were still there. Sometimes the person you think is limiting you is actually helping you access parts of yourself that you had forgotten were possible. Avoidants often postpone emotional processing until the emotion becomes impossible to ignore. Instead of sitting with guilt, sadness, fear, or regret when something happens, they may push those feelings aside and move forward. They rationalize the decision. They distract themselves. They convince themselves that everything will eventually settle down. But emotional avoidance does not make consequences disappear. It simply delays the moment when they have to face them. Betrayal can create a fracture that cannot be permanently covered with explanations. When you stop offering the same warmth, patience, and access you once gave, the emotional consequences become much harder for them to ignore. Suddenly, there is no longer another person absorbing the impact of their behavior. They are left with the result of their own choices. And for someone who has spent years escaping uncomfortable emotions, that confrontation can be deeply unsettling. The moment you stop protecting them from the consequences of their own behavior can become a turning point. They are forced to sit with thoughts they previously pushed away. Maybe they wonder why they reacted the way they did. Maybe they replay the conversation where everything changed. Maybe they think about the moment they could have chosen honesty, but chose withdrawal instead. They may question why they pushed away someone who genuinely cared. The answers are not always comfortable. They may discover that the problem was never your worth. It was their fear of what real connection required from them. Genuine intimacy asks for honesty. It asks for vulnerability. It requires consistency, accountability, and emotional presence. Those are exactly the things an avoidant pattern often tries to avoid when fear becomes activated. So when they finally look back, they may realize they were not escaping a bad relationship. They were escaping the emotional responsibility that came with a meaningful one. That realization can bring guilt, regret, longing, confusion, and fear all at once. These are not emotions an avoidant person always knows how to process. They may move between missing you and convincing themselves they should not. They may want to reach out and then become afraid of what reaching out would require. They may feel regret but struggle to admit it. They may think about apologizing but fear vulnerability or rejection. Instead of moving directly through the emotion, they can become trapped inside their own internal conflict. Their usual defenses no longer work as effectively because there is no longer a relationship to push against. The silence gives their thoughts room to become louder, And the longer they avoid addressing what happened, the more powerful those unresolved emotions can become. What they once pushed down begins resurfacing in unexpected moments, demanding attention they can no longer easily escape. Eventually, they may replay the moments where they hurt you. They remember what they said, what they withheld, where they disappeared, and how you responded. They may begin questioning their own decisions with a level of honesty they did not have while the relationship was still active. Why did they become distant when things were going well? Why did closeness suddenly feel threatening? Why did they sabotage something that offered them genuine care? Those questions can lead them toward deeper wounds. They may begin recognizing fears surrounding intimacy, rejection, dependence, vulnerability, or inadequacy. Betraying you did not create those wounds. It exposed them. The relationship simply brought them close enough to the surface that they could no longer remain completely hidden. And now that you are no longer there to soften the consequences, those unresolved parts of themselves become much harder to ignore. This is why your absence can become so powerful without you doing anything to create that effect. You do not need to punish them. You do not need to make them jealous. You do not need to post things designed to get their attention or send messages meant to provoke a reaction. Your boundary is enough. When you stop participating in the old pattern, the pattern loses its fuel. They can no longer rely on the same cycle of withdrawal and reunion. They have to decide what they actually want without assuming you will always be available. And that can force a level of self-reflection they avoided for a long time. Your silence does not manipulate them into changing. It simply removes the cushion that allowed them to avoid the consequences of not changing. That distinction matters. You are not creating their emotional realization. You are simply no longer protecting them from the reality of their own choices. Avoidants can spend years believing that emotional distance protects them from pain. But eventually, distance can create its own kind of pain. The walls that once gave them security can become the barriers keeping them away from the very connection they secretly wanted. They may discover that avoiding vulnerability does not eliminate the need for love. It only makes receiving love more difficult. They may have thought they were protecting their freedom when they were actually protecting themselves from being emotionally seen. They may have believed they were escaping pressure when they were actually escaping intimacy. And once the person who was willing to understand them is gone, they are left with a painful question. What if the thing they were running from was not the relationship itself, but the parts of themselves that the relationship forced them to confront? That is a question distance cannot answer. Only honest self-reflection can. The hardest truth may be that you did not leave because you suddenly stopped caring. You left because caring for someone cannot require you to repeatedly abandon yourself. You can understand someone's attachment wounds and still refuse to live inside the consequences of those wounds. You can recognize that their withdrawal comes from fear, while also acknowledging that fear does not excuse betrayal. Compassion does not require you to accept mistreatment forever. Love does not mean remaining available regardless of how someone treats you. Sometimes the most self-respecting thing you can do is stop trying to rescue a connection that the other person repeatedly refuses to protect. And when you finally step away, they may discover that your love was never the chain they imagined it to be. It was a choice you willingly made until their behavior made continuing that choice impossible. That is the lesson they may eventually have to face. They did not lose you because you were too demanding, too emotional, or impossible to love. They lost access to you because repeated patterns eventually produce consequences. Their betrayal did not simply hurt your feelings. It changed the level of trust, safety, and willingness you could offer. Their withdrawal did not merely create temporary space. It taught you that you could no longer depend on them for emotional consistency. And once you learned that lesson, returning to the old dynamic became impossible. They may wish the story had ended differently, but wishing cannot erase what happened. At some point, they have to understand that the relationship did not disappear randomly. Their repeated choices helped shape the ending. The silence simply made that truth impossible to ignore. And perhaps that is the deepest consequence of all. Losing you can force them to finally meet the version of themselves they spent years avoiding. They may realize that they were not protecting themselves from you. They were protecting themselves from vulnerability. They were not necessarily escaping a relationship that was wrong for them. They were escaping the responsibility of showing up honestly inside something that mattered. They were not choosing peace every time they withdrew. Sometimes they were choosing temporary relief at the expense of long-term connection. And now the person who once gave them another chance is no longer standing in the same place.